Well, hi, this is Justin. I want to welcome you to Psychic Roots of Poetry. This is, I believe, our sixth installment, and I'm trying to make these a little bit, circular so that you can come in on the sixth installment and you can pretty much get an idea as to what's happening. I always do these ad lib. I don't have any script. You pretty much know what I want to say, and I'm just going to recap a little bit as to where we've been, because I think that's important. Is to kind of just sum up the first 5 sessions. I wanted you to start to consider poetry as a psychic event, not as a literary event. I'm concerned with a psychic moment, the moment of ecstasy that occurs when a poem comes to you unbidden and the words come tumbling out from somewhere, God knows where, and everybody recognizes that as a special event who's ever had a poem. People who've never had poems come to them, they probably have no idea, and they probably will die having no idea, although I think when they die they'll have some idea as to what a psychic moment is. But it's one where it's clear that that moment of conception of a poem, since your time immemorial, has been a psychic event in that it comes unbidden, just as your voices and visions come to people unbidden. It's a rare occurrence, and it has a truth to it. And when people receive poems, when poems you come to them, they recognize it as a special event. Some say divine, whatever you want to call it, but it's not ordinary. And your consciousness is changed in that moment. You're filled with light, I would say, is the best way to describe it, and your body tingles, and out comes this outpouring of words. And the thing I've been doing, I've been walking back through our illiterate poetry, back to your pre-literate times. And by pre-literate times, I'm talking about 40,000 years ago. Let's talk about that lady who kind of started it all in Africa about 40,000 years ago, that we can now, through the National Geo, and I've put my little penny in too to get my ancestors traced, is you go back right to the beginnings and you see the route that your ancient relatives took, whether they went east or west or north, or whatever it happened to be, and how they picked up certain traits that could explain your traits, because people think they're pure this or pure that, but there's nobody pure anything. When you go back, it all goes back to Africa, and from there it kind of camps in the Middle East for a while, and then it finds its way into other areas before we become who we are today. So it's nice to find what kind of blood mixtures you have. But be that as it may, I wanted to go back to that period. And it kind of recapped also in that I wanted you to understand that in pre-literate times, from 40,000 years on, right till about the age of Homer, just before the time of Christ, or just before the time of Alexander the Great, about 2000 BC, that's when there's the general invention of writing around the world. It started with hieroglyphics and cuneiform picture words, but the real alphabet started to pop up around 2000 BC. And people learned to communicate by reading and writing. A small number of people, by the way, very small number of people. So that the general culture continued to be oral, and the type of poetry that was created in pre-literate cultures continued to be created in those literate cultures, because they weren't really that literate. There was a little thin piece of the educated who had some books among them. They were very difficult to pass around. They were bulky. They had to be handwritten and hand copied. And so, in fact, the ordinary person couldn't go to the drugstore and couldn't pick up a pocketbook on Aristotle. Just couldn't. So everything was passed on as though it was a pre-literate time. That poetry kept being done in various guises, but it was very similar to the poetry that was done in the hunter-gatherer times, for example. It might have been antiphonal, but it was always sung, it was always spontaneous, it always took the form of a story. Because that's the way your dreams come, that's the way the unconscious comes into consciousness. It's in the form of a story. It's either a vision, it's a little picture story that's taking place in you, or it's somebody telling you to do something in terms of visions or voices. Or it's in the case of a poem, is a story comes to you that's a charged story, and charged in that it is metaphoric, it's composed of metaphors, it is rhythmic, and it has a special truth to it. That state for the pre-literate people was constant. That's hard for us to kind of understand, where we have we have an ironclad consciousness. It's a kind of self-reflective that is able to see ourselves in the future driving a new Mercedes-Benz, a 2012 Mercedes-Benz, with a nice blonde on this side and a brunette on this side. Nobody's steering the car, but we're just going ahead into time and seeing ourselves and planning our options. Pre-literate men, as far as we can tell by some studies that were done by Julian Jaynes back in 1960, and which really had been due for a long time, showed us that the pre-literate man didn't really have a self-reflective consciousness. He didn't see into the future. He didn't see himself into the future. Rather, he existed in a kind of state of meditation, which anybody who has worked with pre-literate peoples will tell you that seems to be the case. They can stare endlessly out into the horizon. Doesn't seem to bother them at all, and they'll always tell you they hear voices of the gods. What Jaynes said is, when you went back to a monumental study, he was both a biologist and a lover of poetry at Princeton, and he came up with a monumental study. And this is something, if you're interested at all, if you're watching this show, if you're not interested in this, then what are you watching the show for? Here's Jaynes, and what he said is that all of our conceptions of pre-literate men as being just a dumber version of ourselves are completely wrong. This is the book he came out with around 1960, in which he used various proofs, both the biological and neurological, as well as the poetry that had made its way into literate times by one hook or another. That's a very tricky procedure, by the way, to come in, because when a pre-literate culture evaporates in the face of literacy, often that all of its songs go with it. But in fact, because of that, your parallel kind of structure is that some exist for a time, and it was transcribed into writing. And from the examination of those, of the gods always speaking to the heroes, he said, this isn't a figure of speech. This is what happened. This is the way, when people faced an extraordinary situation, rather than plotting their future within their minds, a voice would speak to them from the right side of their brain, which he said at that time had linguistic capabilities. So that's an ongoing discussion now in the biological, neurological field, but all poets felt it was correct. And he said that poets are basically throwbacks. They have a little bit of that older consciousness in them, just like some people are born with little piggy tails, a little kind of reminder of our animal heritage, you know. So that's to give you some of the background on this. And I went one step further, and I'm going to give you some background on myself too, so you'll understand as to how I came to some of the conclusions that I have come to. Is that I believe that older form of consciousness, some remnant of it, is still within us, everyone, not just poets. Poets, it tends to be dominant. In people who are schizophrenic, according to Jaynes, it's over-dominant, meaning it has erupted and it has taken control of our consciousness. So people hear voices all the time that they can't ignore, and they'll walk into the ocean and drown because they have to obey the voices. That's how strong the voices are. And that's how strong the voices were for pre-literate man when they advised him to do this or do that, to take that action when he was faced with a novel situation. And it's somewhat similar to the voices that poets hear, but they're not commanding, guiding voices. They're storytelling voices. It's a little bit different, but they are those same type of voices, and they will come up if you take some steps to quiet your consciousness and go through a couple of techniques that I've devised over a period of years. They came to me, really, I didn't devise them, that will allow you to speak poetry with no preconception whatsoever as to what you're going to say. And I'm going to play one of those for you now, just to remind you again as to what I'm talking about. I'm going to play a very simple one for you that came to me many years ago as I was photographing the inside of my office. And as I looked at the pictures that I took, both moving pictures and stills, this poem came to me, which I recorded right on the spot as I watched it. So it's an example of using pictures to beckon the muse. In fact, I spoke about that, about the muse comes when she wants to. And if you're lucky, she'll come many times in your life. And many poets have techniques to try to entice the muse to come up, the unconscious to come up. But it's a tricky proposition. It will happen or it won't. Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. But in the case of oral poetry, it's so wired into us, and the muse is so available in that state of that little pre-literate remnant that it's often that, in fact, we'll get a little visit from the muse and a poem will result. Here's an example of this, and the titles and the rest of it I put on afterwards, but really what you see, the minute and a half of poem, that's exactly how long it took to make the poem. I'll use the pictures as a catalyst, and I fix them up a little bit afterwards. So here you go. Sometimes when I look at myself from far, far away, I don't know who I'm looking at. It's a boy, or it's a picture, or it's something made of imagination, something shaped of wax guttered onto the table. I could live forever and not understand these words.
I don't know how it happened.
I cannot crush them with my hands or give them to you.
But it did.
They're only dust. What can I say to you?
Across the bridge.
You who are looking at me. What can I tell you?
And now I'm burning it.
What can you say to me? Here,
I was
in this room,
thinking of you.
on this afternoon,
I'm burning my bridges.
when nothing happens,
I can never go back.
where I look out the window and everybody is coming and going,
Look at you.
and only I have no name.
I was thinking of you.
Only I
Again.
have no name at all.
I have to tell you.
I was thinking.
Well, there you have that little minute and a half. You heard in the background there was a second voice. That was a recording of Scylla Liscombe, who is also one of the people here in Sarasota who can do that spontaneous oral poetry. And I happened to be playing it at the time, so I just recorded over it, and out came that particular soundtrack of that poem. In one of those moments of being lost, trying to find myself, Those poems can be done by anyone. I've taught thousands of people of all ages to do them. It's not a teaching, it's just teaching them a technique that allows the older consciousness to emerge slightly. It will never emerge as the older one. You can't go back to the pre-literate times. That just can't be done. But there's enough of it there to make those poems possible. And I have CDs after CD after CD filled with them, with people who have done them with me, because they're usually done communally. I've explained that before, with a speaker and a responder. But I just wanted to remind you as to what I was talking about. Some of the things I've been talking to you about may seem pretty far out, and in fact they are far out for people to really think about. All to me they seem to be ordinary knowledge now. And that knowledge that I have, I'm going to show you something here. I want to show you something here. That knowledge that I have came as a result of a series of psychic experiences that I had starting in 1970 and 71. And I have just finished a book called Alice Hickey, Between Worlds. It's classified as a novel, but for all intents and purposes, it's really a fictionalized memoir of the period 1970 to 79, a 7-8 year period. It's in the form of a journal, starting with the psychic events that overwhelmed me, and then the remaining in the first year, and then the remaining 6 or 7 years trying to unscramble them with the help of several psychics. The major one, who was Alice Hickey, who was a extremely talented psychic, beyond talented. It was just unbelievable what she could do. But also she was extremely talented in the fact that she knew all of the background of psychic events. She had met Jung when she was very young. She was in her, I guess, late 70s when I met Alice, and she had traveled throughout Europe with her husband and into the Far East, trying to find out who she was, since she was one of these people who had only one foot on the earth. She was constantly seeing things, having visions, voices, whatever you want to call it. She was not in this world half the time, and she wanted to know who she was and not just the queer girl down the street, you know what I mean? So she was lucky enough to study with some leading gurus and psychics, and one who was Carl Jung, and I happened to meet her, as they say, accidentally in a supermarket. We were both looking for some tomatoes, and I didn't know who she was at the time. She was just an old lady with gray hair, and I couldn't take my eyes off her eyes, and I kept looking at her because her eyes were so pale that I felt I was going to look right through her, you know, and it made me very uneasy, you know. And she came up to me, and she was talking to me. She asked me if I'd found what I was looking for, and she got closer and closer, and I had a sensation is that I was getting very dizzy, and I felt this little vibration against me, and all of a sudden I couldn't hear her anymore. I could see her. Her lips were moving, but a voice inside my head said, "You haven't found what you're looking for." And absolutely freaked me out. And she gave me a kind of pat on the shoulder and walked out into the parking lot of the supermarket, and I never saw her again for another 3 years. That event really threw me because I've had psychic voices. Like, they come to me in moments of stress or moments of high creativity, but this was something else because even though it came from within me, it seemed to have something to do with her. Her presence somehow was a conduit for a psychic voice coming into me. I had no idea what it meant. That was followed by a series of visions of an ancient person in my mirror about a week or two later. Appeared 3 times to me, didn't say anything, just stared back at me. A very long hair, kind of burlap, coarse, looked very worn. Looked thousands of years old, to be frank about it, like somebody who lived in a very early stage of a pre-literate culture. I took him to be a Celt, but it could have been anybody. And then finally, about 3 months later, a long poem came to me, which I had no idea what it meant, but I was lucky enough to have carried a portable recording studio with me at the time. And I'm going to play a little bit for you, and then I'm going to bring all those pieces together. Alice taking the supermarket, the picture of the ancient Celt, and this myth, which I took to be a myth, and which I eventually came back, and besides recording it at the time out in Santa Monica, California, where I was visiting, if I can find it here. I guess I don't have it here, but in fact I'm going to see if I can bring it in here, because in fact I wanted you to see it. So just kind of bear with me for a second if I can do that. And I'm going to go up and I'll see if I can find that. I had a little crash today, so I thought I'd be prepared for the show, but it looks like I wasn't, and I'm going to bring this in now and I'll be able to show it to you. What had happened to me once I recorded the thing, it was an audio recording basically that I had done, is that I came back to Florida. I didn't know what it meant. I knew what some parts of it meant. I knew it was a kind of creation myth of some kind. But the way you do these things is when they come to you, like in fact your lips almost move of their own. It's not like you're channeling where people sound like Chinese, crazy Chinese people. That in fact the poems don't really you come that way, but they come rhythmic and they come metaphorically, and there's some part of it I understood as it was coming to me, and some parts I didn't, but I knew I had to say something, these particular words, and it would be correct. But when I tried to examine it logically later, I had no idea what the goddamn thing meant, and it almost drove me to the point of a mental breakdown, to tell you the truth. I never had a poem like that had come to me as though from somebody else's mind, you know. I'm going to play the opening and the ending. They're about 1 or 2 minutes long, so I'm not going to take a long time. Don't try to figure these out. Just let them kind of fall on you on rain. I finally did this as a result of a young man that come up to me about a year after I came back from Santa Monica. His name was Dan Pothast. He was a new college student. He was a mathematical video, you know, he's in the middle of everything. And he was kind of like Soul Speak, and he showed me these fractals he had made, and I thought they were fascinating, animated fractals. They were organic and beautiful and exotic. But I had no idea how to use them, even though I was making videos at the time. And then suddenly when I came back from Santa Monica and I was listening to the recording one day, this is what happens when you step into the stream. And the stream, I'll simply say, is a stream of psychic energy, and don't ask me to go any further. But the first step I took it was in the supermarket, and the second step was in the character who appeared in my mirror, the vision, and the third step, I was knee-deep in it, was the poem as it came to me in California. And the third step into the river or the stream was when Daniel Pothast appeared from nowhere with these fractals, and I realized that the fractals contain four characters or entities, because they're not really people, they're entities that match the four entities in the myth, which in fact I eventually came to call the Witness's Log, because that's the name that came to me as soon as the poem came to me. I didn't know what that meant either, but it just came down. So I'm going to play the opening ones for you, and it's quite beautiful, and you can see the fractals. It's the opening, and then it's the closing, and you hear myself and Joan identifying ourselves, because we didn't know what the hell was going on, to be frank about it, when we recorded it. Here it goes.
This is Justin and Joan on January 13th, 2001. Witness's Log, number 14. Witness's Log, Part 1, Entry 1. In the beginning, there was nothing. There was only the sound of darkness and us. And us. We were waiting.
We were waiting
to be remembered.
to be remembered.
We were like moss on the mountainside,
We were moss
waiting for the sun.
on the mountainside. Waiting. Waiting.
When the listeners came, we changed.
We changed.
We became witnesses.
Witnesses.
We heard the listeners entering the dark valley far beneath us.
We witnesses.
We heard them moving beneath the dark folds of light.
We heard them. We heard them.
No one has ever seen the listeners.
No one.
It is too dark beneath the deep folds of light, far beneath us in the valley.
Far beneath us.
But we can hear them moving beneath the dark folds of light. We can feel them. The dreamers tell us they can still hear the visitors, but it is very soft. They say it sounds like slow, soft, distant thunder from far, far away. That is what the dreamers say. It sounds like soft, distant thunder from so far away. So far away.
So, there you go. You have a little taste of what that myth was, and what you get is just the elegiac opening, and you get the elegiac closing. In the 7 years that I spent with Alice Hickey trying to figure out what was going on in that myth and why I had received those other visions and voices, that I was very lucky, as they say, another accident that I came into touch with Alice Hickey, who was consumed with the preliterate period and the Mother Goddess period, which she felt was a period that we were headed back towards, meaning not back to the original Mother Goddess period, which could be both beautiful and horrifying, but to a modification of what you call the male spirit, which is the rational scientific spirit that has overcome the Western culture to the point that it's lost its feelings, basically. And as it's lost its feelings, it's lost its taste for poetry. And she thought that for us to regain ourselves as human beings, we would have to learn to become more intuitive. And she felt that the age of Aquarius, which Jung had also kind of caught on to, and everybody else, including the Mayans, even though they didn't call it that, there was an ending of a cycle, these great astrological cycles. You know, the last one was the appearance of Jesus, and in fact the one before that was the appearance of writing. They come in 2,000 years cycles. You know, things that are going to change consciousness, and for sure the act of writing did, and for sure Jesus did, in the immense cultural change that took place over the next 2,000 years. But out of that came a super rational culture, Western culture, which only believes that the physical world exists and everything else is an hallucination. You know, so when you kind of get into that mode of thinking, that in fact what happens is that you lose all of your balance, and what happens, you have guys like Hitler. You start to rise up, and that's what Jung said. We had to come to our intuitive senses that good and evil are inextricably linked, and they feed off each other. And we can't think we can eradicate evil anymore, that they were caught, in terms of the supermodern Europeans, the rationalists, were caught completely flat-footed by Hitler and that rising of that destructive force. But anyway, we had to come more in touch with our intuitive selves. He called it the union of opposites. And she felt that it was a way as a return to something of the feminine principle. So when she bumped into me and I bumped into her, and when we met 3 years after the initial meeting, I said, I got to talk to you. I don't know what you're doing to me, but I've had all this happen to me since you've come to me. When I finally traced it back, what I understood to be true is that was exactly at the time that I made my first breakthrough into soul speak. That is, it suddenly occurred to me, after years of trying, how I could speak spontaneously from the unconscious, as the ancient poets did. And here's the secret. If you get ready for it, come on in real close. You have to surrender to it. It's there. You simply have to surrender to it. Let go, and it'll come out. So all the techniques I have devised have been to help people who are a little uptight to let go. And it will happen. It will happen to anyone. I put so many people through this of various walks, I can't tell you. From the extremely mentally disturbed to the extremely mentally rigid, if you have it like that, who have never felt anything in their lives, that it will make that breakthrough for you. If you follow the techniques, it will make you surrender to the muse, and the muse will come up. And the first time it comes up, it can be quite an experience, because all those feelings, that two-way commerce that should be established between soul and self, which I've been bottled up on us, it finally makes an appearance through the beauty and the cathartic healing of a poem. It can be quite an emotional experience. Anyway, what it came to me at that time, finally, after working with Alice and tracing down this and that, is it became clear to me that the myth that had come up that I couldn't understand was a preliterate kind of atomic diagram, if you want to think of it. And you can see that somewhat in the video, that was the beauty of the video. It suddenly began to occur to me that, wait a minute, the way preliterate peoples expressed things was through art, through poetry. That's the only art that they knew. So this had come from somewhere in the collective unconscious back through some preliterate consciousness who kind of knew things that I didn't know about the entities that control consciousness. And it had come out in the form of a poem that never explained itself, never gave any assumptions or axioms. It just came out, and it came out in the form of a story about our becoming human. That is, we became witnesses. We began to tell stories, as I've explained to you before, one of those stories being the story called poetry. And then it goes away. In the end, you'll feel that in terms of there's a dying going on there, but it's a cyclical operation where in fact that state of consciousness comes, we express ourselves, and it dies, and it comes again. So it's a very, very, just to untangle that became everything. Once I saw that, and I realized that this confirmation had come up from my unconscious to confirm what I had suspected all along, and which I had been proving through working with thousands of people, that this older form of consciousness exists within us and can be activated, if you will, momentarily in the creation of a poem. And it also showed me that the way that the preliterate consciousness was constructed thematically, if you will, is exactly what occurs at the moment of conception of a poem. That is to say, the poetic moment and preliterate consciousness are exactly the same players involved. So they are kind of intertwined, and it explains why, as we lost that older way of knowing, if you want to think about it that way, and our new way of rational, self-examining, self-reflective, plotting the future came up, that our ability to love and to cherish poems and to create poems on a human basis for all of us tended to go downhill until it's at the state today where it's almost non-existent. But it can be relit, and when it's relit, it brings the two halves of us together, soul and self, unconscious and conscious mind. It's a kind of mating. It's orgasmic also. That's what the matings feel like. They're orgasmic, so that's why it feels so good. That's why poets do it. So it just comes together, and it's at that moment, no matter how sad, it's always beautiful, and that makes us whole again. And if you continue to do it in any way you want, you can dance it out, you can mime it out, you can sing it out, you can speak it out, whatever it happens to be, but you have to surrender to that part of you that is most familiar with how to tell stories, and just let it happen, and you'll be going. So you have a little bit of knowledge now as to why I've been able to say the things I've been saying, because I went through a kind of exploration of looking into poetry. What is poetry? What exactly is poetry? What happens at the moment of conception? Where does it come from? Where did the first poem come from? Why did it come? All those questions were basically that all the answers kind of lay within Alice Hickey's knowledge and Jung's knowledge and my own knowledge as I examined it, and my own psychic events that were trying to tell me something, which is that the moment of poetry and the moment of the preliterate consciousness are exactly the same, and we have it within us, and we can return to that moment, and we can become less detached, which is what's happening to us today. We're just like little robots, very smart robots, but we have no roots. We can make enormously bad decisions, and we will sometimes forget to value our intuitions as to what is the right thing to do. Because as Plato showed us through Socrates, you can't define what right is or justice is or beauty is. You have to feel your way towards it. He kind of called it an ideal form, a kind of metaphysical form. And all of those stories he set up to show the smart Greeks they didn't know what they were talking about. What he was really trying to say is you have to feel it, baby. It's in you, and you have to surrender to it. And what is true is something within us that says it's true, not any kind of definition we can give to it, or beauty, etc., etc. Those are his so-called ideal forms. And in fact, for Jung, they were the same thing. He called them archetypes. And poetry, the ability to create poetry, is within us also. It's one of those ideal forms that forms the poem. You can go completely brainless, basically, in the conception of a poem, and it will come out, and the muse does all the work. You just have to move your lips at the right time and not get distracted, which can be hard if you're scared of that type of event. Anyway, that's it for now. I'm going to sign off with with some soul exposures, which I like to show you because they're I hate to say acted out, because they're not acted out. You know, most of the soul speaking we do is done in a recording studio, and it's done with mics, and we use pictures or we use words to kind of jog ourselves. These are done where we're actually standing and moving, and we have a movie camera trained on us. It's like a 7-Eleven robbery video, you know. There's 2 spotlights, and we have either some words or pictures above the camera, and we just step into the spotlight, and we let whatever happens to our bodies happen, and whatever poem wants to come out. So they're performed, but they're performed with no forethought, no direction, no nothing, and it's done with 2 or 3 people. And I think they're extraordinarily beautiful and strange, so we're going to play some, and then we'll be off the air.
Sometimes, in my dreams, I feel like a hypocrite. There are these little stairs that go up and down inside my mind, and these very stiff people are walking up and down in it, you know? They don't have any eyes. They're just like me. Half a person, not a whole one. Some people call us garbage because we're so black. But I know who we are, and you don't. Sometimes in my dreams, I'm filled with a sort of tenderness. It's like it's out on the front porch, waiting for you to come home. But I know God is watching. And God can be mean, you know. There's a lot of hate to go around. God the Father, God the Son. We have their arms around each other. A little red heart between the 2 of them that beats like that, you know. It's not enough. It's not enough, baby. Sometimes in my dreams, I'm high up in the heavens. I'm incapable of making any mistakes at all. But everyone here knows I'm a thief. That somehow I got past time. And past their bright glittery eyes to get here. For we're smart animals, we are. Aren't we? We climbed out of the river. We could take heaven by the throat.
Oh, yes.
No one would ever say anything to us.
Yes.
No one.
Oh, yes.
Not even time.
Oh, yes.
That thief. Time.
Oh, yes.
I'm waiting for you.
Yes.
Time.
Oh, yes.
I'm waiting for you.
Oh,
Time.
yes.
Time. Time. I'm waiting for you. Time. Sometimes in my dreams, I can feel you watching me. Like you were God and I was a hero of some kind. Someone who bore a little watching. God forgives a lot of things, but some things he doesn't. So you have to be real careful, if you know what I mean, because God is so unpredictable. That's about as plain as I can make it to you. I'd keep your house in order if I were you. Start to sing once in a while, like you're standing in the rain or waiting for someone.